All right. Hi, everyone. So I am re-recording the lecture from this morning because I was completely doing the screen sharing wrong. And so I did not realize that you guys were basically seeing the chat and then my video panel on top of the slides I was trying to present. So I know we're just starting out this class, and so there's going to be some mistakes on my side, so I am really sorry about that. And I thought I'll just re-record this so that you guys can watch it without those issues. So we reviewed from last class and basically talking about how do we decide if something is or is not a mental health disorder? How do we define abnormality? We also talked about some historical perspectives on abnormality, meaning how did mental health disorders used to be viewed and treated? And we spent just a little bit of time talking about modern mental health care, but we'll talk a lot more about that as the semester progresses. So then chapter 2, hopefully everyone is following along in the Revel because it goes into a lot more detailed information, and then I kind of just cover the highlights and then add things that aren't in the book. But chapter 2 is all about the different approaches to understanding mental health disorders. So we have what have historically been 3 completely separate approaches: the biological approach, the psychological approach, and the sociocultural approach. And so traditionally, these were thought of as 3 completely different approaches, different areas. So if I am a medical doctor who believes that depression is caused only by biology or genetics, I am likely to prescribe medication and maybe not worry so much about therapy. Whereas if I'm a psychologist who believes that psychological issues, psychological factors, or underlying mental health disorders, then I'm much more likely to recommend that the person undergoes some kind of therapy treatment. If I'm a social worker or a community worker operating from a sociocultural approach, I might actually see the cause of the disorder a little differently. I might be more inclined to look at environmental factors. I might look at spirituality, religion. I might recommend changes in the environment or local resources in that case. And so, again, historically, these have been thought of as separate. One thing we'll look at today is the biopsychosocial approach, which combines all 3 together. And next class, we'll actually be talking about the common elements and effective treatments just a little bit. This entire lecture is mostly all the biological approaches. So let me give you an example looking at this from 3 different theories. So John Smith is a 30-year-old married man who feels down most of the time. He's having frequent intrusive thoughts that he's not good enough, despite his personal and professional successes. He tries to overcompensate for his thoughts by taking on more than he can handle, which leads to even more negative feelings of inadequacy. His wife suggests that he seeks help after she finds him crying. And so today I asked, what disorder does this sound like? And someone in the chat told me depression and anxiety. And that's exactly right. It could definitely be either, it could be both. They overlap quite a bit, and most people will experience both. If they have one, they'll probably experience the other at some point of time. So if I am looking at this from the biological perspective, I'm very likely to think that John Smith's depression, anxiety, or just symptoms in general are being caused by underlying biological issues. So maybe neurotransmitter imbalance or chemical imbalance, as it's often called. Maybe I think that there's something physically going on wrong with John that's causing his symptoms. So I might order some tests to determine that. And I'm very likely to prescribe medication as the treatment because that's what I believe is going to help treat the underlying biological cause of depression or anxiety. However, if I'm a psychologist, which I am, I'm a lot more likely to look at some of the other factors. So I might look at John's thoughts. These in feelings, these thoughts and feelings of I'm inadequate, I'm not good enough. I might look at his behavior of overcompensating. I might examine how often he's crying and see if it's something that's normal or not so normal. I might try to figure out, is John going through a traumatic time? Has he recently lost someone he loves? So I'm going to approach this a lot differently than the medical doctor, perhaps. And I'm probably going to recommend that John get some therapy treatment. Now, I might also recommend he goes to see a psychiatrist or doctor to get medication, but I would do therapy to treat this depression or anxiety. And let's say I'm someone who believes in the sociocultural perspective. I am more likely to look at John's environment. So, what's going on that's making him feel so down, frustrated? Are there people in his life who are telling him he's inadequate? Are there factors at work that are contributing to his depression and anxiety? So, I'm going to look outside of just his own personal internal state, and I'm instead going to look at the environment and ask him what's going on. Again, these theories were really thought to be incompatible, but now we know it's really a combination of all three. Ideally, we might get John examined by a doctor or a psychiatrist for medication to see if that would be helpful. We would have him talk to a psychologist or any kind of therapist, and we would also look at larger cultural issues and also environmental issues as well, and try to see if there's anything we can do to help with those. Okay, so then that brings me to this next classic debate of nature versus nurture, and it's actually very relevant to psychological disorders or mental health disorders, because some people believe that mental health disorders are more caused by genetics and biology, and some people believe that they're more caused by environmental factors and stress, and then some believe that it's both, a combination of both. So I ask, and if you're following along, you can kind of think for your own personality, your own behavior, who you are, what would your percentage be? How much do you think is influenced by nature versus, and when I say nature, I mean basically your internal biology, your biochemistry, your neurotransmitters, your genetic code, versus nurture, your home environment, how you were brought up, your basically entire cultural and environmental circumstances. So just think about that for yourself. I personally really feel kind of both. I really feel like I can see some things that I've inherited personality-wise, but also mental health-wise as well from my parents. And at the same time, I feel like my home environment has contributed to who I am quite a bit. So I definitely, for me, I would say somewhere like maybe 40 nature, 60 nurture, or 50-50, but it's going to be different for everyone. And interestingly, it's actually different for every single disorder. So there are disorders where we know there's a huge biological genetic component. And then there are some disorders where we actually think it's more environmental. So it really depends on the mental health disorder. But what's best is to use the biopsychosocial approach that I mentioned. So this is the combination of all three approaches that really examines each one in order to determine where this mental health disorder, or what's contributing to the mental health disorder. Okay, and so that brings me down to this graphic. This is actually from your book, so it goes over it pretty well, but just to go over this again and make sure you are understanding, because I think this is a really important concept. So this is called the diathesis stress model. When I say diathesis, I think risk factor, and especially I usually think genetic or biological risk factor. I like the word predisposition as well. So this is an inherited predisposition for a certain disorder. So one disorder that we know has a huge biological genetic component is schizophrenia. We know you're more likely to develop schizophrenia if one parent had it, and then even more likely if two parents had it. So we know that there are some kind of genetic biological diathesis in this case. However, we really can't ignore the stress component. So these are environmental stressors that make a person more likely to actually go on to express their predisposition. So what that means is somebody could have a risk factor or a predisposition for schizophrenia, but never go on to develop the symptoms of schizophrenia. Just because you have a predisposition doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily develop the mental health disorder. A big part of it is, how was your environment? Did you grow up in a traumatic environment, a chaotic environment? Did you have childhood sexual or physical abuse? Was your family constantly in conflict? Did you experience significant life changes like the loss of a parent, the loss of a loved one? There's a lot of things that could have been very stressful. And so the stronger the diathesis, the stronger the genetic risk, the less stress is necessary to actually end up having the disorder. So if you have a lot of genetic predisposition but you have a relatively great, stable childhood and easy life, you're way less likely to actually end up having schizophrenia than someone who has the predisposition and had a lot of life stressors. And so I'll just give you another example. So I study substance use disorders, and I didn't give this example in class today, but here's just another example for you guys. So if you are familiar with substance use disorders, let's say alcoholism, for example, we actually know that you're much more likely to develop alcoholism if a parent or even grandparent was an alcoholic. So there's definitely some kind of risk factor or predisposition if you had a close family member who experienced alcoholism. However, we know that a lot of people have family members who have alcohol problems, and then they do not go on to develop an alcohol problem. And a big part of this is stress, environmental stressors. So let's say you grew up in a family with both parents who were struggling with alcoholism, and you had a very chaotic, unstable childhood. You were in and out of foster care. Maybe you were abused in that kind of situation. You already have the diathesis, the predisposition, and then with all of those life stressors, it is going to be much more likely that you would also end up developing a problem or struggling with alcoholism. So again, I like this biopsychosocial approach where you're looking at biological factors, so genetic, vulnerabilities, physical health symptoms. You're looking at social factors like the peer environment, your family circumstances. You're looking at psychological factors, coping style, self-esteem, social skills and social support. And then you also look at things that overlap. So some things such as trauma is both social and psychological. They all really work together to cause a mental health disorder to develop. And so because of that, it's important to consider all of these in treatment. Okay, so I pulled up a video in class that's demonstrating the case of Phineas Gage. I'm not going to play the video in this, but it is here for you guys to click on, so it's embedded in the PowerPoint slide. And basically what this showed is, if you remember, if you've talked about Phineas Gage in your Intro to Psych class, it really shows us an example of somebody who was functioning relatively well. So Phineas Gage was a railroad worker over 100 years ago, and he was described as very efficient and a very hard worker by his family members. He was described as a good person, easygoing, a good family man type of person. However, while working on the railroad, he had a large metal pole go through his brain. So this is essentially, now we can use MRI technology because we actually have his skull still. Well, Harvard has his skull. So we can look and we can see that this is the area, the precise location of his brain that was damaged in this accident. And that's called the frontal lobes. And so the frontal lobes are so important in determining things like, how do we cope with stress? How do we regulate our emotions? How do we reason and think critically? A lot of things that we would call our personality are governed by the frontal lobes. So after this accident, his family said he completely changed his personality. He was no longer good at work. He was no longer the same kind of person anymore. So basically, this is demonstrating the first point on this next slide, and that's that mental health, I guess, abnormalities, that again, I like to call it mental health disorders, are caused by, one thing is actual abnormalities or differences in the structure of the brain. So a more modern example than Phineas Gage would be something like a traumatic brain injury. So let's say you're in a really bad car accident, or you're a soldier that's deployed and an IUD bomb goes off, and your actual structure of your brain is changed. You might see changes in personality. You might see mental health disorders develop that you didn't used to have. Okay, the next way that biology underlies mental health disorders is through a biochemical imbalance. And so a lot of people have heard about chemical imbalance causing depression. This is really reasoned to be imbalances in either neurotransmitters or hormones. We're going to, on the next few slides, talk about these different types of neurotransmitters that are implicated in a lot of mental health disorders. And again, I hear this often with depression, is that I've been told or that I've heard that I have a chemical imbalance in my brain, or depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And then the last biological underpinning of mental health disorders is genetic abnormalities. So this is the theory that disordered genes actually lead to mental health disorders. Okay, so I don't need you to memorize all the parts of the brain, although I think if you are actually a psych sciences major or you want a career related to psychology, you really should just go ahead and start, because it's really important to know the different areas of the brain. But for this class, for our purposes, know where the frontal lobe is and what the frontal lobe is responsible for in our brain. So things that are critical to our functioning and our personalities, our mood, our mental health, all governed or ruled essentially by the frontal lobe. So things like problem solving, emotion regulation, so being able to cope with stressful situations, having critical thinking and reasoning, all of these things that we associate with mood regulation, these are all controlled by our frontal lobes. So I want to get back to this idea of a biochemical imbalance. So this is the theory that mental health disorders are caused by an imbalance in brain chemicals, specifically neurotransmitters, which, as a refresher, are biochemicals that actually communicate with each other. So basically neurons communicating with one another, and that really governs or controls almost everything we do. You have to have those neurotransmitters functioning correctly. And so the theory behind this is that the amount of a neurotransmitter is really important and is associated with a specific type of mental health disorder. So I asked in class, what have you guys heard it's associated with depression? And someone correctly answered serotonin, and then also dopamine. Serotonin is the one I typically hear, but dopamine is also associated. So I'm going to cover each of those in a minute. So the theory is that too little or too much of certain neurotransmitters lead to specific mental health disorders. So again, the theory is you have too little serotonin, so we can give a medication that increases serotonin and it will improve your depression. The problem is it's not so simple because there are over 100 different neurotransmitters. I'm going to talk about the big four, the ones we know are implicated in a lot of disorders, but there are so many more that probably are influencing our mental health that we know little about. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about each of these. So serotonin is so crucial for mood regulation and our overall emotional well-being, which makes sense that if you have a problem or an imbalance of serotonin, that you'd feel feelings of depression, possibly anxiety, because your mood isn't being regulated. Dopamine is actually associated with our experience of reward. So anytime you do something and you think or you feel pleasant emotion, that's because of partly because of a flood of dopamine in the brain. And the reason I have substances on here is because it's one of the main neurotransmitters implicated in addiction, because when you use a drug or alcohol, you get a rush of dopamine and that feels really good, especially at low doses. And so over time, you can develop an addiction basically to the dopamine rush portion of that. And then also the dopamine depletion that happens when you come down from using a substance after a long period of time. So norepinephrine, think adrenaline. So it's basically when we go into fight or flight mode because we're stressed or amped up, that's norepinephrine neurotransmitter released in our brain and body. And then GABA I associate with anxiety. So when you have an anxiety disorder, you're actually thought to have a dysfunction or an imbalance of GABA. More GABA is actually, GABA is thought to inhibit anxiety. So the more GABA, the less anxiety, except, it needs to be balanced. So the biochemical imbalance theory of depression is actually pretty controversial. So the video that's linked here, if you take a minute to watch it, is a commercial for Zoloft, and it's the original commercial for that antidepressant medication. And basically the point of it is saying that the only cause of depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that chemical imbalance can be completely fixed by taking Zoloft. So the pharmaceutical industry definitely likes this idea of the biochemical imbalance for mental health disorders, because if the disorder is caused by a chemical imbalance, we can give you a medication to balance this out. And the reason that this is potentially controversial is it's really ignoring all of the other factors that can contribute. So yes, there are definitely biological factors, but we know that there are also environmental, sociocultural, psychological factors that are contributing to mental health disorders. And so the question I asked during class and had people think about is, if someone thought their mental health issues were due to brain dysfunction, how might they feel? And the answer that I was given is the one that I typically receive in class, which is really makes a lot of sense, is that you might feel like there's something wrong with your brain and that you have to take medication to recover, which some people are okay with that, but other people aren't. And so it ignores all these other kinds of coping skills that we can do to actually help us feel better, like exercise, yoga, breathing, anything you do that makes you feel better other than medication. It really kind of ignores that. And so this was the thought question, and it's on the discussion board. So I gave everyone around 3 minutes to answer this in class, but if you weren't in class, go ahead and answer this on the discussion board. So would you personally prefer your mental health issues to be due to a chemical imbalance or to non-biological elements such as your coping style or environmental factors, and why? I just touched on this briefly during the lecture. So how do we know which disorders have more of a genetic or biological component? And that's through behavioral genetics, which is twin studies. So we look at identical twins who have been raised together or raised apart. If you have two identical twins that share 100% of their genetic code and they're raised in different households, they're adopted out separately, but both of them still go on to develop a mental health disorder, and you have thousands of documented cases of that happening, well, now you can see that genetics is playing a huge role in that disorder. Whereas if you have two identical twins raised in the same family, so similar environments, and one goes on to develop the disorder and one does not, we can see that in that disorder, perhaps if that's replicated again many times, we can see that in that disorder, perhaps environment is playing a bigger role than genetics. But one thing that I mentioned multiple times in class is it's not just one gene. There's no gene for alcoholism. There's no gene for depression. There are multiple genetic abnormalities coming together to create a specific disorder. And more genes related to that disorder means higher risk. Okay, and then this is something I find fascinating. So the interaction between our genetics and our environment. So again, with identical twins, we study this to see how much of a disorder is environmental versus biological, but then also how do those two work together? So epigenetics is really an entire field devoted to looking at how environmental conditions affect the expression of genes. Please, if you get a chance, look at this link. It's really interesting on mother rats grooming their baby rats. Also kind of cute. So they've done experiments where the mom rats actually give a lot of affection and attention to the baby rats, and those rats grow up as adults to be way better adjusted and show less anxiety behavior than those rats who weren't groomed, who weren't taken care of or paid attention to as baby rats. So especially in the first week of life, how the mom behaves towards her little baby rat is very important in the expression of certain genes that influence the stress response. So basically your prenatal and your infant and childhood environment can influence whether or not you go on to express certain genes. Take a chance to watch this video that I showed in class. It's an example of children who were raised in a Romanian orphanage, and they were given no affection, no attention their entire lives. And then as they developed and grew up, their brains actually did not develop normally. And they ended up having much lower IQs and much less brain development than other children their age. So a really sad example, but a good one. And then also later studies have shown that you can recover some of these functions later on if you are placed in a stable environment. Okay, and then that's where we ended class. I'm going to go ahead and get through this so that everyone can just watch this part at the end. There really was not much left at all. And then we can go ahead and start the psychological and sociocultural factors during the next lecture. So the reason that I'm grateful for these biological theories and what we know about the medical and genetic underpinnings of disorders is that we've been able to create targeted medications for disorders. So this is so important because a lot of people are greatly helped by medications. There are some controversies around taking medication, but a lot of people, it's life-changing for them. So antipsychotic drugs are mostly prescribed to treat psychosis, so disorders like schizophrenia, delusional disorder, but also sometimes prescribed to treat bipolar disorder. Antidepressant drugs treat depression. We'll talk a lot more about those when we talk about depression. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, And so basically what that does is it inhibits the reuptake of serotonin, meaning there's more serotonin available to your brain, increasing that level of serotonin. Lithium is one of the main old school mood stabilizers that's usually used in the treatment of bipolar disorder. We also have newer mood stabilizers, things that are used now more commonly to treat bipolar disorder. Things like Lamictal, Depakote, if you guys are familiar with any of those. Those are actually anticonvulsants. So anticonvulsants treat symptoms of mania. So again, other things we use to treat bipolar disorder. And then anti-anxiety drugs treat anxiety and are pretty controversial actually. So these are things like Xanax, Klonopin, lots of different brand names that are basically raising the level of GABA to inhibit anxiety. And the issue with them is that they can become addictive, but in the short term, they're really effective. So unfortunately, medication is not a great solution for everyone because it can have some serious side effects. So for example, antipsychotics can cause a condition called tardive dyskinesia, which is involuntary movements of the tongue, face, mouth, or jaw. So I will play this video really quick because I didn't play it in class. So for anyone who's watching for that.
Try not to be distracted by the movements in her lower face. Please focus your attention on her eyebrows.
Okay, so essentially she's got this uncontrollable movement of her mouth, and that's pretty common with tardive dyskinesia. It could also be your arms or other limbs, and you have no control over them anymore. And so then you have to either treat the tardive dyskinesia or discontinue the antipsychotic. So another controversial treatment for some mental health disorders is ECT or electroconvulsive therapy. It was first used back in the early 20th century as a treatment for schizophrenia. Now it's much more likely to be used for depression. Essentially, a brain seizure is induced by passing an electrical current through the brain, and this is done now in a very standard format. Back in the day, people weren't properly sedated and it was really kind of cruel, but now they have proper sedation and they know the correct level of basically electrical impulse to pass through the brain. It has a lot fewer side effects. So I've linked a video here on YouTube that shows modern electroconvulsive therapy. So I'd highly recommend that you take a minute to watch that if you're interested in seeing how ECT works these days. So electroconvulsive therapy is usually only prescribed or recommended to a patient who has tried medication and therapy and it's just not really working to help their depression. All right, so I'm going to end there. In next class, we will pick up with the psychological and sociocultural theories of mental health disorders.